确保两河生命不受干扰的全面贯彻实施，是中英两国的共同利益，也是我们双方共同的责任。中国政府愿继续本着友好合作的精神，同英国政府一道力促这一目标的实施。我们也希望广大香港同胞和各界居民同心协力，为香港的繁荣稳定和更加美好的未来做出贡献。
We have demonstrated the strength of our commitment to it today by the signatures that you, Mr. Premier, and I have set upon it. I pledge that the British government will do all in its power to make the agreement a success. It will be our pride and our pleasure to administer Hong Kong up to the 30th of June 1997 in accordance with the highest principles of British administration.
新聞報導員每日就係坐喺呢一個報警裏面同大家報導新聞，其實都睇住唔少今日嘅新聞，第二日就變成謊話。1984年12月19號，中英兩國領袖簽署聯合聲明，強調要保持香港繁榮安定，發展要循序漸進，盡量避免干預香港嘅事務。10年之後嘅今日，當日簽字嘅趙紫陽同戴卓爾夫人都已經落咗台，而香港嘅情況呢？中國介入香港事務越嚟越多，英國又自行其是，放棄同中國有商有量嘅政策，而家呢就真係順利過渡，各有各做。究竟點解會變成咁嘅呢？當然，中英雙方都有責任。不過睇翻過去13集《帝國斜陽》，我哋可以總結到一啲過去英國撤出殖民地嘅規律。簡單咁講，最好當然唔需要撤走啦。如果迫不得已要走，就要係光榮撤退，同埋盡量安排接班人，保留住英國喺當地嘅利益同埋影響力。呢幾年英國對香港嘅政策多多少少都可以睇到呢啲撤退嘅規律嘅。我哋而家就先睇下中英談判初期英國係點樣掙扎，想保留香港嘅管治權呢？1979年3月底，當時嘅港督麥理浩爵士北上訪華。當佢同中國領導人鄧小平嘅會談接近尾聲嘅時候，麥理浩突然間打破外交慣例，提出咗原定議程裡面冇嘅香港前途問題，希望喺1997年之後，英國能夠繼續管治香港。
Hong Kong as an island had perpetuity, but anything else, Kowloon and Boundary Street and New Territories, always had a deadline. Even people who built even the airport, even the facilities at the airport, was always the lease was granted until one day before 30th of June 1997. So historically, it was always there. The thing to do was to ensure that the Hong Kong could continue to progress and carry on expanding. So there must be an indication of how Hong Kong would continue to prosper and whether government could lease more territory or just tell everybody your lease will not be renewed.
對呢一個問題，鄧小平一口拒絕，但係就補充話：請投資者放心。當時鄧小平啱啱確定咗領導人嘅地位，開始喺中國推行開放改革政策，發展經濟，而且中國同國際嘅交往亦都啱啱起步。一個繁榮發達嘅資本主義香港，對中國嘅發展可以話係不可或缺嘅重要因素。麥理浩呢一次訪華，雖然冇為香港問題達成任何結論，但係鄧小平嘅説話就確實對香港起到一定程度嘅穩定作用。之後嘅幾年，前途問題喺香港越嚟越受到關注，而中國亦都藉住接見香港訪問團，黨主席華國鋒、外長王華、人大委員長葉劍英等等，喺唔同嘅場合一再宣示佢收回香港主權嘅決心。相反嘅，英國就好沉默，一直冇乜嘢動靜。直到1982年，戴卓爾夫人宣布訪華，決心就香港前途問題向中國攤牌。 不過英國嘅打算係點就唔俾香港人知，連權力核心嘅行政局議員亦都唔例外。
It was not even Margaret Thatcher's time. It was Edward Heath's as a Prime Minister. And there was a time when we were in London and we did speak about the old days, and Edward Heath did not seem surprised because he says, oh, we knew all about it. We knew the Chinese decision all about it.
戴卓爾夫人宣布訪華之後冇幾耐，英國皇家海軍出兵8000里，收復喺南太平洋嘅福克蘭群島。到咗嗰年嘅秋天，鐵娘子就挾住福島戰勝嘅餘威訪問北京。雖然佢嘅幕僚事先同佢講咗，要喺1997年之後繼續擁有香港主權並不切合實際，但係佢同中國領導人會談嘅時候，就依然態度好強硬，堅持關於香港嘅3條條約依然有效，仲話只有繼續由英國管治，香港先至可以保持繁榮。可惜佢嘅對手態度同佢一樣咁強硬，半步都唔肯退讓。人民大會堂門外呢一次失足，已經清楚顯示會場裡面嘅談判誰勝誰負。跟住嗰半年，中英雙方就香港前途談判應該點樣傾嘅問題僵持不下。英國仍然希望討論香港主權誰屬嘅問題，直到1983年3月底，戴卓爾夫人寫信俾趙紫陽，同意作出讓步之後，談判先至可以正式開始。但係談判嘅過程就波折重重。
雖然戴卓爾已經知道咧係中國要收翻香港，喺處理嘅過程裏邊咧，仍然咧係以嗰3條條約咧嚟到作為基礎。咁因此初講咧就係可唔可以延續英國嘅治權。過咗1、2個回合之後咧，知道唔可以啦。咁下一步咧，當時香港方面咧就有一個意見，話可唔可以咧就用主權嚟到代替治權，即係話97年之後咧主權翻去中國，但係治權咧仍然喺英國手。咁又過咗幾個回合都唔可以啦。咁大家可能記得咧，當時香港嘅港幣咧係對美金咧就跌得好緊要啦，就香港產生咗啲信心問題。
英國被逼交出香港嘅主權，換取中英談判，下一步應該點行呢？正如英國撤出好多其他殖民地一樣，當然係盡力保留香港嘅管治權同埋影響力。當時香港各界人士，包括一啲同港英政府關係密切嘅人，紛紛出謀獻策，譬如主權換治權論、公司論等等。主權換治權，顧名思義係英國用交還主權嚟到交換97年之後對香港嘅管治權。公司論亦都係大同小異，即係擁有主權嘅中國做董事長，但係就唔理事；冇主權嘅英國就做總經理，具體管治香港。而其中一個向中方推薦公司論嘅人，就係後來做咗兩局議員嘅譚慧珠。
睇翻佢一段嘅回憶錄裏邊咧，有一段係譚小姐嘅，就話公司論，佢提到公司論，到底當時譚小姐點解會提出呢個方案，同埋佢都喺佢嘅回憶錄裏邊都講到，就話佢都唔可以肯定到底係譚小姐自己提出嚟，定係幫英方做說客。
我諗當時嘅情況咧，就喺度探索緊咧，是否可唔可以用某一啲嘅方法嚟到處理香港嘅問題。咁當時有幾種嘅講法嘅，一個講法就係公司論啦，一個講法就可唔可以咧就係主權換治權啦。咁呢啲當時咧啲係即係探求不同嘅方法嚟到解決。其實而家諗翻轉頭咧，好多英國已經知嘅政策咧，我哋香港人咧係未必知道。但係我哋嘅目標咧，就係為咗可以盡量爭取，即係保持原有嘅制度。咁因此試一試亦都無妨。
喺香港前途談判問題上，中國一直堅持談判係中英兩方嘅事，唔接受香港作為第三者參與。而英國初時嘅態度亦都差唔多，幾乎一切都唔俾香港人知。但係到談判嘅後期，英國就改變咗態度，多次強調要尊重港人嘅意願。並且以呢一樣嘢作為談判嘅籌碼，就係咁樣引起咗中方嘅不滿，指責英方打民意牌、搞三腳凳。 圍繞住呢個問題嘅爭論，到84年初可以話到咗高潮。當時嘅行政局議員兼立法局首席議員羅保爵士喺立法局提出動議，要求中英兩國喺達成任何協議之前，都應該提交立法局討論。
11 meetings had taken place in strict confidence, spanning over 18 months. Some knew a little that was going on, others knew a little bit more, but the people of Hong Kong knew nothing. And also that any agreement at that time, if you had reached an agreement, any agreement would be decided by Britain and China, the two sovereign powers. So we ask you, how will Britain decide whether the agreement was good or not? The Prime Minister or whoever would put it in the House of Parliament. And the people of the Parliament will vote on the future of Hong Kong without knowing the sentiments of the people of Hong Kong. China had said that Hong Kong had no representation. It was two sovereign governments, fine. But the people of Hong Kong had to know what the future was. Unless you wanted prosperity and stability, you had to have faith and you have to have trust. You just not signing a blank check.
羅保動議最後都喺立法局通過，但係冇幾耐之後，怡和宣布遷冊。呢兩件事令到中英談判再度陷入僵局，跟住嘅幾輪談判可謂乏善足陳。戴卓爾夫人喺佢嘅回憶錄嗰度承認，到咗呢個地步，手裏面嘅牌實在太少，唯有面對現實，唔再貪求喺97年之後繼續管治香港。呢個決定就由外相賀維喺香港當眾宣布，
令到香港喺1997年之後仍然繼續由英國管治嘅協議呢，呢個係不切實際嘅。
賀維宣布咗之後，香港前途談判可以話轉入咗直路，一直到雙方簽署聯合聲明為止。聯合聲明嘅內容係97年中國收返香港嘅主權，但係97年之前就由英國繼續管治。97年之後，香港仍然可以係資本主義社會，現有制度不變，維持50年。到時香港就用中國香港嘅名義喺附件1詳細列明中國對香港基本方針政策，內容最矚目嘅就係鋪陳咗未來嘅政制圖像，特別行政區首長由協商或者選舉產生。司級官員由首長提名，至於立法機關就由選舉產生，行政機關要守法，向立法機關負責。
聯合聲明呢，基本上係符合香港人嘅利益同香港人嘅意願嘅。我哋睇一睇即係中英聯合聲明簽署之後，香港人嘅反應就知道啦。
第一呢，佢就係將喺香港最寶貴嘅制度同埋生活方式嗰個概括嘅情況咧，係已經寫晒落去。第二點咧，就係佢亦都可以咧將香港基本嘅政府政策嘅神髓咧係寫咗出嚟。
但係啊，簽署咗呢個聯合聲明之後，英國人有冇努力爭取貫徹咧？咁樣呢個係一個問題。
英國簽咗聯合聲明之後，要諗嘅係點樣走，點樣先至係既得到國際輿論嘅讚賞，又得到香港人懷念甚至係歡送嘅光榮撤退。按照英國喺其他殖民地嘅慣例，喺撤走嘅時候都係要搞還政於民。但喺香港問題上，由於中國強烈要求還政於中，並且已經着手制定97年之後嘅香港嘅政制軌跡，令佢不得不接受銜接嘅原則。按照中方嘅既定軌跡，將繁榮嘅香港安定順利咁交翻俾中國。本來無論係還政於民，抑或係順利過渡，喺英國嚟講都可以解釋做光榮撤退。但係如果喺兩種政策之間搖擺不定，忽左忽右，咁就會令人無所適從，造成咗混亂。好不幸，香港過去嘅10年過渡，英國啱啱就行緊呢一條路。
英國撤退離開香港嘅政策呢，佢係想還政於民。似乎最近戴卓爾夫人喺佢嘅回憶錄裏邊咧都提過，即係希望咧有一個感覺咧就可以將香港變為可能半獨立啊咁嘅體系啦。 咁還政於民就係當時嘅口號啦。然之後咧就英國亦都想光榮撤退或者有秩序咁樣撤退，咁就係兩種政策嘅糅合裏邊咧，就使到咧我哋睇到英國一方面咧就係簽聯合聲明，呢個係佢光榮撤退或者有秩序撤退嘅需要；另一方面咧佢又開始咗政改。
1982年，香港舉行有史以嚟嘅第一次全民普選，雖然選嘅只係區議會議員，權責有限。但係封閉咗100幾年嘅殖民地政權，總算首次向全港市民打開咗一道小小嘅門隙。當時作為港府政務司嘅鍾逸傑就係推行政制改革嘅負責人。佢話當時港府開始進行政制改革，同香港前途問題冇關。
It was going on a different track, if you remember, and it started it really started when Lord Maclehose came. Before he came, Legislative Council was a very small organisation, small body. And when he came, he started on the process of widening the representation in the Legislative Council by appointment. But it began then, and he brought into the Legislative Council representatives of different spheres of society than had been included in the Legislative Council before. And then later on, we began the development of the district boards, and that was a response really to a need to get at public opinion in the districts in some sort of structured way.
姑勿論港府推行政制改革嘅原意係點樣，事實就係巧合嘅事情喺之後又一再出現。84年9月，中英談判達成協議，並且草簽聯合聲明。但係喺之前嘅2個月，港府就率先公布代議政制綠皮書，建議喺立法局引入間接選舉。裏面話呢啲建議嘅主要目標係逐步建立一個政制，使到佢嘅權力穩固咁立根於香港，有充分權威代表香港人嘅意見。呢一句話引起中方嘅指責，批評英國偷步搞還政於民。
Well, it is a strong phrase. I agree. Deeply rooted in Hong Kong. It sounds as though perhaps it's a veiled attempt to make Hong Kong independent. But that wasn't really in the minds of the writers of that phrase, I'm quite sure. It really meant that they wanted the people in the Legislative Council to be truly representative of the Hong Kong community. But it didn't mean to ignore the fact that Hong Kong is part of China and will be part of China in the future. It didn't mean to overlook that fact in making that statement, I'm sure.
到12月，聯合聲明正式簽署，港府又喺之前1個月公布代議政制白皮書，正式建議選舉團同功能團體嘅選舉方法。白皮書仲話，各界人士大都認為喺1988年逐步開始先選出少數直選議員，至到97年嘅時候就應該有相當多議員通過直選產生。終於，港府一連串嘅行動引發出一場本子風波。
現在我們不能不看到有些不按本子辦事，已經有不按本子辦事和有些方面或者有一種不按本子辦事的一種趨勢，我們不能不注意這樣問題。
中方嘅強硬立場令到港府推行政制改革嘅步伐明顯放慢咗落嚟。87年嘅政制檢討綠皮書面世，建議成立民意審裁處，研究88年係咪應該有直接選舉。同84年嘅白皮書比較，新嘅綠皮書語氣明顯溫和咗，檢討嘅範圍亦都收窄咗。
87年呢個代議政制檢討呢， 係在經過好詳細嘅考慮之後呢，我哋係可以講係將嗰個範圍呢係縮窄咗。
如果英國將呢個主權還翻俾香港民呢，就香港人講咩可以得做咩啊？但係如果英國而家唔係將主權還翻香港人，係還翻中國政府，咁當我香港人接受呢個中英聯合聲明，接受呢個主權由英國歸還中國嘅話呢，我哋已經接受咗呢個規限，冇辦法。
當時中國正在起草基本法，港府就發展代議政制，將來兩套制度點樣銜接，應該邊一個銜接邊一個，一度成為爭論嘅重點。而88年應唔應該有直選議席，即成為政制能否銜接嘅關鍵。我哋就需要有一個民主嘅政府。為咗88直選，香港掀起咗連場民意大戰。亦都因為咁樣，88年2月公佈嘅政制檢討白皮書，最後就以港人意見分歧呢個理由，否決咗喺84年嘅白皮書度曾經講述過嘅大多數香港人都贊同嘅88直選。
關於88直選被否決嘅問題呢，我知道呢個亦都係英方屈服於中方壓力底下嘅，因為實際上我同一個新華社嘅高級嘅官員曾經討論過呢個問題。佢當時同我講，佢話97年有直選嘅咁樣。我話假如基本法規定咗97年有直選嘅話，點解88年唔可以實行呢？咁樣佢當時就講話，假如88年當時基本法未最後決定有咗直選，會引起香港人對直選嘅要求更高，造成咗壓力呢，使到基本法唔能夠唔增加直選嘅席位。佢話咧，直選會好似一個雪球咁樣越滾越大。我話只有直選係好啊，選過一次之後喺88年選咗，香港人先有更大嘅要求，希望增加呢個直選席位嘅啫。好嘅嘢先會再要求啊嘛。咁好嘅嘢點解你要拒絕呢？咁樣當時佢答我唔到嘅。
Had the government at the time ever considered the response from the Chinese government?
Not in making that particular decision, I think. It was a Hong Kong decision, a British decision. But in the back of one's mind, obviously one has the wider picture of Hong Kong and its future. It would be one of the factors, let us say, but it wouldn't be the overriding factor. The overriding factors were a reading of the public mind.
Well, it's just circumstances. Actually, it's not a question of concession. It's just circumstances that you have to adjust your things, because you just, unless you're doing progression all the time, when you have something done before 84. See, September 84 was joint declaration. The first paper was done before that. Then so after the joint declaration came and after everything else came, so you have to readjust to meet what you have been agreed later.
1年之後，北京學運演變成6·4事件。喺整個過程之中，香港亦都出現咗歷來最大規模嘅遊行，1/4嘅人口150萬人上街示威，物資、金錢源源不絕咁支援北京學生。為咗穩定人心，當時嘅港督衛奕信爵士喺嗰年嘅施政報告裏面就提出新機場計劃、居英權同人權法案措施等，結果又一次引起中方嘅指責。
這個領土全都花光了，你說怎麼辦？你說怎麼辦？你說怎麼辦？
事實上，6·4一役唔單止影響中英關係，亦都令到中港關係蒙上陰影。不過喺政制問題上，銜接論仍然係至高無上。6·4事件之後，行政立法兩局罕有咁達成咗兩局共識方案，要求喺1995年立法局有半數嘅議席， 即係30席由直選產生。不過喺銜接嘅大前提之下，港英政府冇接受兩國共識方案，英國反而派遣前駐華大使柯利達秘密訪華，就政制問題同中方討價還價。
What happened was that Mrs. Thatcher asked me to go out as her representative to Peking in December 1989 to open the case, to pick up the threads, first of all, with China after Tiananmen, because we had to have our lines of communication open to them, whatever we were going to do. Secondly, to open the case for more directly elected seats. We started off, if you remember, at that time with 10 directly elected seats for 1991, 15 for 1995.
我哋試過有一次，但我唔記得係90年末啦，應該係1991年初，喺廣州開會咧，開到第2日就講剩嘅一點咧，就大概係應該係18啦，因為20個直接選舉嘅人咧，喺個會議停頓咗嘅。咁當時咧就有一位基本法嘅起草委員，佢喺報紙上講咗啦，佢走去問李后先生點解嗰個會議我哋自己好似停頓咗咁咧？咁啊，李后先生向佢表示咧，係等緊中英政府雙方咧係有某種嘅決定。
We got up from 10 to 18 for 1991, and from 15 to 20 for 1995, and there was a rising curve from then on, going right up into the next century. And the point about those changes was that they would stick, they would last, because the Chinese agreed with them, and they were written into the final version of the basic law.
為咗令代議政制同基本法銜接，中英雙方都作出咗一啲讓步。不過世事往往出人意外，銜接論喺1992年突然間大幅貶值，還政於民，捲土重來。
Shame as a practicing Christian that I've read the Basic Law and the Joint Declaration more frequently than I've read the New Testament.
一个是违反联合声明，中英联合声明。第二呢，也是不符合基本法的规定的。第三呢，也是违背了过去几年里面中英双方就95年这个选举的安排所达成的。
That the proposals I have made, which are my best judgment on the point of balance in Hong Kong thinking on this important issue, do not breach either the Joint Declaration, the Basic Law, or any previous discussions between the present sovereign power and the future sovereign power.
那么在这次会谈当中，我是很详细的、很具体的。不厌其烦的向他一条条指出来，哪些地方是不符合基本规定，但是彭定康先生很遗憾的，他都没有接受。
Where in the Basic Law does it tell me what to do about the 9 new functional constituencies? Let anybody show me where it says in the Basic Law.
英方没有权利来随意对基本法做出解释。
现在有一些人好像把自己打扮成一个香港的救世主，
所以我说，彭定康先生将来历史上要成为香港的千古罪人。
现在，英方又为合作制造了人为的障碍，由此而引起的一切严重后果，只能由英國政府負完全的責任。
港督彭定康嚟咗香港年半，已經備受中國各級官員同埋輿論機器嘅抨擊。本來佢話想建立一個比較公平開放嘅政治制度， 比較慷慨嘅社會保障制度，對於香港人嚟講，未嘗唔係一件好事嚟嘅。問題係，我哋喺未來仲有一個老闆中國，佢哋唔滿意英國搞小動作破壞協議，以致到我哋喺夾縫之中無所適從。究竟英國喺離開香港之前，點解要搞咁多嘢呢？我哋問下港督。係一啲過往嘅例子，包括印度同埋馬來西亞。英國都曾經喺政府自己預定嘅時間日期之前，提早撤出殖民地。喺歷史中吸取教訓，我哋點樣可以有信心英國政府唔會喺1997年6月之前提早撤出香港呢？
Well, you mentioned two particular cases, and in both cases we were being pressed by the local population to withdraw earlier in order that democracy and independence should be set up sooner. That's a historical parallel, which isn't the same in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, we're not preparing the community for independence. That's never been an option as it was in our other colonial dependencies. We're preparing Hong Kong for a transfer of sovereignty, so there are no comparisons.
要光榮撤出香港，對英國保守黨或者對你個人嚟講，有幾重要呢？
What does withdrawing with honour mean? It means not only attempting to administer Hong Kong in a way which is competent and honest, it means doing so in a way which is foursquare in line with the joint declaration, and in a way which, in our judgment, stands the best chance of ensuring that the joint declaration is honoured in the spirit and the letter for 50 years after 1997. So honour for me, and I think honour for the United Kingdom, will be measured by the extent to which, on the 30th of June 1997, people agree that we've done everything we possibly could to secure the implementation of the joint declaration afterwards.
Then what if 如果我重複如果事情喺97之後並唔係好似計劃之中咁推進，特別係中方近日否定政制銜接，咁英國會點樣維持佢對香港嘅道義責任呢？
And it's a point which Chinese officials don't always appear to recognize, is that the joint declaration does bind both parties to a concern about Hong Kong's well-being and way of life for 50 years after 1997. It's a treaty lodged at the United Nations. So inevitably, we will have a continuing interest in Hong Kong's way of life and well-being after 1997. That is not to say that we would seek to interfere with China's sovereignty. We would not. But we would be interested in the implementation of the terms of the joint declaration. I very much hope that China will abide by the joint declaration. I believe that will be the case because I think it's in China's interest as well as, of course, in Hong Kong's interest.
但係喺最近嘅新聞嗰度睇得到咧，中國政府嘅態度咧，其實都係講緊話，係你令到呢個1997年嘅過渡出現咗問題。
What may have made the transition more difficult is that there is a fundamental issue in the joint declaration which some Chinese officials seem to have difficulty comprehending. The joint declaration talks about the executive in Hong Kong being accountable to the legislature, and it talks about the legislature being composed wholly through elections. Now, we assume that when Chinese officials put their name to the joint declaration, they imagined that those elections would be fair rather than unfair. And what the discussion is about, what the debate is about, is whether we have election arrangements which are credible or whether we have election arrangements which are incredible, which don't give the people of Hong Kong a proper choice and which erode the foundations of the rule of law. That's what the argument is about. It's not an argument raised by the British side. It's not an argument raised by the people of Hong Kong. The people of Hong Kong have been very supportive of the position taken by the Hong Kong government in all this.
香港可能會係唯一嘅一個地方，大部分嘅人或者對英國嘅撤退抱有矛盾嘅心情，而唔係抱支持嘅態度。
I think that everyone in Hong Kong recognizes or most people in Hong Kong, recognize the reality of 1997, even if some are rather fearful that the consequences might not be all that they would wish. I hope that as we come up to 1997, people will be seeking to return to Hong Kong, not seeking to leave Hong Kong. I would regard that as a great achievement if it was the case. But I will do everything I can to maintain Hong Kong's traditions and values and the way of life of an open and plural society, because I think that is the best way of securing people's commitment to Hong Kong for the future.
Including 包括或者會改變你嘅政制方案，同埋完完全全嘅同中國政府有一個合作。
Cooperation is something that we genuinely seek, but sometimes Chinese officials give the impression that by cooperation they mean that everybody else must do whatever they want at any given moment of the day. That's not cooperation, and that's not the way to win the hearts and minds of the people of Hong Kong. Sometimes Chinese officials talk about us seeking to extend our influence beyond 1997. Nobody's trying to do that. And what we're talking about is the people elected by the citizens of Hong Kong helping to run Hong Kong after 1997. Hong Kong people running Hong Kong was, after all, a phrase of Chinese officials. One country, two systems was a Chinese vision and concept. The autonomy of Hong Kong in so many matters was spelt out and agreed to by Chinese officials. The issue is whether those concepts, whether those principles are to mean anything or not.
你點樣預期本港嘅政黨發展？特別係考慮到中國政府唔能夠容忍當權派以外嘅聲音。
Given the extraordinary economic success of Hong Kong, given our sophistication in every aspect of life, I think that people's aspirations politically are extremely modest, and I think they're very moderately expressed. I think that for Chinese officials to talk about Hong Kong as though its political aspirations represented some sort of threat to China is extraordinarily far-fetched. I think if I was a Chinese official, I would not only regard a successful Hong Kong as a huge asset for China, but I would also be delighted that people in Hong Kong were so moderate in their opinions. I imagine that in Hong Kong, as in other communities, political groups, political parties will develop in a way which principally reflects different notions of how society should be organized. I very much hope that we don't see a polarization between those who appear to be more in favor of Peking or more in favor of Hong Kong, because I think that would be damaging.
越嚟越接近97年啦，你最唔希望見到嘅係乜嘢呢？
I would least like to see any disagreements on political issues, which there may be. We're embarked on an extremely difficult job. And I just want to underline that, because what we're talking about is not just a peaceful transfer of sovereignty, which is a fairly rare thing. We're also embarked on a peaceful transfer of sovereignty, which attempts to encapsulate and safeguard the way of life of the community where sovereignty is being changed. One country, two systems. Very difficult thing to bring off successfully, so nobody should be surprised that there are occasional problems. But I hope that we can avoid those problems on some political matters, poisoning the whole of the relationship between Hong Kong and China and conceivably the United Kingdom as well.
假如而家係1992年7月，一切都可以從頭開始嘅話，你嘅做法會有啲乜嘢唔同呢？
I think that's always an impossible question to ask. Everybody can be wiser after the event than they were at the time, and it's ridiculous to say that none of us ever learn from our own behaviour and from our own performance. But I hope that I would have been just as determined, whatever I'd known about the events after 1997, I hope that I'd have been just as determined to stand up for Hong Kong and to stand up for Hong Kong's interests. That's at the nub of this debate. That's at the centre of this argument. Because if we don't stand up for Hong Kong before 1997, there seems to me less chance of anybody standing up for it after 1997.
多謝晒。究竟英國能唔能夠光榮撤退？我哋今日仲未可以下判語，或者我哋可以10年之後再做一次帝國斜陽香港篇，到時希望可以再見。